Keynes, Part 1. Classical economics has a problem, and that problem is the Great Depression. For 150 years at least, classical economics is easily the dominant view of economists across the planet Earth. But then we get to the Great Depression. Economy is supposed to fix itself, and it's supposed to fix itself because wages and prices fall. And yet we have 12 years where unemployment rate's over 10%, which only ends, by the way, because we get into World War II. Who knows how long it might have gone on if we hadn't gotten into World War II. And prices and wages fell a lot. Prices and wages in the United States fall by at least a third. So we have this huge fall in wages and prices, and yet it doesn't solve the economic problems. We need another theory. We need a new theory. And that new theory is going to come from a man named John Maynard Keynes, who we actually have seen before because he was part of the Bretton Woods Agreement and other stuff that we've talked about before. He started his career writing about probability, and then he wrote about money, and then publishes in 1936 a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which obviously must be about employment, interest, and money. His theories were well known by then. He had worked with the British government, worked with Franklin Roosevelt, and so it wasn't unknown what he was going to say when he published his book in general, but still it's going to change the economic profession. Keynes and the classicals are like matter and antimatter. Everything that the classicals thought, essentially, Keynes is going to say is wrong or is flawed. And the first part of that is what we would call a fallacy of composition. Classicals say, look, if all the markets are in equilibrium, everything has to be right. Keynes is going to say all those little parts together can't just be added up and make a whole, that we have to look at the big picture. To Keynes, these things are more complex. There's interactions, things work together, there's links, there's things that are going to link A to B, and you can't just say, what happens if the labor market's in equilibrium but only 5 people have jobs? So maybe we have to look at a more complex system than looking at each individual market independently and believing that equilibrium in each market equates to equilibrium in the whole. So we're going to bring into this idea some new elements. We're going to talk about spending. We're going to talk about expectations. And we're going to talk about the importance of financial markets. Keynes says what matters overall to the big picture in the economy is spending. That what matters is how much we spend, consumption spending, investment spending, government spending. It's the big picture of spending across the whole economy, not the little picture of each market. Now think about why that matters. Let's suppose that you work at a restaurant and a group of people start coming in every Monday and they leave you a $100 tip every Monday. Now you have an extra $100 to spend that you didn't have before. And let's say that you go out and spend it. You go out and get a fancy haircut every week. Get your nails done, something. Whoever you spend that money with looks at that money as income. Your spending is somebody else's income. So you got that $100. That was your customer spending. But to you, it's income. You go get your nails done. To you, that $100 became spending, but to the person who did your nails, it's income. Now they go to the grocery store and they buy $100 worth of groceries. That $100 to you is spending, but to the grocery store, it's income. Income moves from person to person, and as it moves from person to person, think about that. You had an extra $100. That means the hair person or nail person has an extra $100, which means the grocery store has an extra $100, which means, you with me? It's extra 100 and extra 100, and there's 300 or 400 or 500 more dollars of income across the economy because one person spent $100 more. Instead of focusing on equilibrium, Keynes says to focus on spending, which is a function of our income. Okay? In fact, there are people who will tell you that Keynes's theory is really a disequilibrium theory. It's not even about equilibrium at all, but he just didn't know how to say that. And I'm not sure how to go with that theory, but there are people who believe that Keynes was actually disequilibrium theorist. Keynes has to introduce some new vocabulary. You know that to come up with a good theory, you have to come up with new vocabulary. So he comes up with this term, marginal propensity to consume, the MPC. The marginal propensity consume is the additional spending that results from $1 of income. The additional spending that results from an additional $1 of income. You go to a homeless person, they're walking down the street, a homeless person sees $20 sitting on the ground, they pick it up, they're probably going to spend all of it. Their MPC is 1. For every $1 you give them, they spend $1. Middle class person walking down the street, sees the 20, picks it up, might or might not spend it, you know. If you do, it's not affecting your spending pattern. It's nice to have an extra $20, but you know, maybe you'll buy an extra appetizer at dinner or something. So maybe you spend 50 or 60 or 70% of that $20, but not the whole thing. Bill Gates walking down the street probably doesn't bother to pick up the $20 because he doesn't need it, but even if he picks it up, it's not going to affect his spending at all. So the MPC is going to vary by the kind of person you are. To summarize, spending creates income, which creates spending, which creates income. And depending on how big the MPC is, that income and spending get multiplied. If we only spend half, if everybody spends half, then $100, if I get $100, I spend 50, the person who gets 50 spends 25, the person who gets 25 spends 12.5, and we've spent $177. But if we spend 90%, that 100 turns into 90, the 90 turns into 81, the 81 turns into 72, and now 4 steps down the road, we've already got $200 and something in income. So there's a multiplier effect. Whatever happens in the economy gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It's a snowball rolling down the hill. When you put more money in, that money's going to get multiplied. If I take 100 out, then all of a sudden that not only do you get 100 less, but the nail person gets 100 less, the grocery store gets, and we get a bigger decrease in income as we move along. The greatest economics movie of all time is The Lion King. If you haven't figured that out, you will. Economics is all about the circle of life. The antelopes eat the grass. The lions eat the antelopes. The lions die, fertilize the grass. The grass grows. The antelopes eat the grass. The lion eats the antelopes. The lion dies and fertilizes the grass. And everything's good as long as we keep spending, as long as we move from point to point to point. And the economy is going to be fine unless the hyenas show up. And we'll talk about who the hyenas are someday. But if the hyenas show up, eat too many antelopes, all of a sudden that circle gets broken. The money doesn't move right from point to point, and we end up with economic tragedy. Okay, so circular flow of income. Keynes says consumption is a function of income. Savings is a function of income. Savings is not primarily based on interest rates, which means we're going to blow up this theory of the circular flow from the classicals. Again, the classicals say, hey, savings are always going to be equal to investment. Keynes already has said, no. Consumption, you decide. You get an income. You decide how much you're going to consume, your MPC. You decide how much you're going to consume. Savings is your leftovers. Savings is what's left after you decide how much you're going to consume. And then Say's law, because you don't spend all your income and you can change your consumption pattern. A Keynesian is not going to believe in Say's law. They're going to say, look, yeah, production creates income, but there's no reason to believe that all that income is going to get spent. There's no reason to believe that all those markets are going to end up in this beautiful equilibrium. All right, so that's the end of part one. In part two, we're going to talk about investment and expectations and financial markets and other fun stuff.